Dear ladies, gentlemen, and everyone in between. And depending on your location, good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to this webinar. Now, my name is Maria Dalla. I'm the director of the Human Rights House Foundation, and I have the honor to moderate today's communication between the panel and the audience. Now, the background for having this event today is that the Human Rights House Foundation published its 2020 annual report, where we dwelled on how it has been to defend human rights in these unprecedented times, and we want to continue on that discussion. COVID-19 impacted our work, it impacted our well-being, and so today we ask, how was it for you as a leader? How was it for your colleagues, for your institution, for your community? And what are the lessons learned from 2020? And we go further. How do you see the human rights situation in 2021 and beyond? What do you expect? And based on your experience, your expertise, your expectations, what are your recommendations to states, to donors, for them to be good and relevant in their support to and protection of civil society and human rights? Now, we have today 5 great panelists with us, and they will kick off this discussion. But before I pass over the microphone to the speakers, I would like to introduce them to you so you get to know them better. Now, I go to Azerbaijan, where we find Shala Ismail. She's based in Baku, and she is chairing the Women's Association for Rational Development. And her NGO is a member of the Human Rights House of Azerbaijan. Now, Shala, she also serves as a country facilitator of the Azerbaijan National Platform of Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum. She's also advising several grant-making foundations, and I mentioned a few, the Global Fund for Women and the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Rights. In addition to issues like gender equality and women empowerment, Shala is monitoring and reporting on civil society development and fundamental human rights, both in Azerbaijan and abroad. And then we go from Shala in Azerbaijan and we continue to Ukraine, where we find Tetiana Pechonchik. Tetiana is the head of the board of an NGO called Smina Human Rights Center. It's based in Kyiv, and her NGO is a member of both the Human Rights House Crimea, but also linked to the educational Human Rights House in Chernihiv. Tetiana is a journalist. She works in the field of freedom of speech, support of civil society and the human rights defenders in Ukraine, including the occupied Crimea. And Tetiana's voice is regularly heard at international platforms, at the UN, at the EU, and the Council of Europe. And there she reports on the human rights situation in Ukraine, and she provides advice on issues like freedom of movement, impunity, torture and ill treatment, as well as armed conflict victims. And from Tetiana in Ukraine, we go to the Czech Republic, where we find Rostislav Valvoda. Rosta is the executive director of the Prague Civil Society Center. The center focuses on the grant making, on capacity building and learning to civil society and independent media in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Now, Rosta has himself long experience in working in human rights across Russia, Eurasia and Eastern Europe. Rosta was the co-founder of the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum, and he also launched the Prague Civil Society Center in 2014, while he was still the head of the East European program at People in Need. Then from Czech Republic, we go to Poland, and there we find Jacek Kurczak. He is leading one of Poland's leading think tanks, a very prominent think tank. It's called the Institute of Public Affairs. And Jacek has been for some decades been very active as a co-founder, having a role as a co-founder and board member of a number of both Polish and international NGOs. And here I mentioned a few. The Prague Civil Society Center that Rosta is leading, that Jacek has had a role in establishing, and also he's part of this European Partnership for Democracy in Brussels. Now, Jacek, he covers issues like European integration, democratic governance, populism, and migration. And his voice is very often heard in both Polish and international media, where he is commenting on current domestic European affairs and political developments. So from Poland, we continue, and then we end up back in South Caucasus in Georgia, where we find Katie Abashidze. And Katie is based in Tbilisi, and she's a senior human rights officer at the Human Rights House Foundation, and she has been with us for the last 7 years. Katie is a lawyer, and she monitors the developments in fundamental human rights, both in the Western Balkan and in South Caucasus. She provides support to human rights houses in South Caucasus primarily, but she also coordinates a regional protection program for human rights defenders at risk. And she also provides legal analysis to the foundation's advocacy work. So, you see, the foundation is very, very honored to have you all with us today. And we have had the privilege to know you and to work with you for several years. So now I just want to give you a warm welcome before I give you the floor. Before that, I would also like to say, dear audience, welcome. We have together now 1.5 hours. This is live broadcasts, and we would like you to participate in this dialogue with the panelists. And you can do so on our platforms, on the Human Rights House Foundation's platforms. You can do it via the Twitter, the Facebook, and YouTube. So please share your comments and questions, and we will make sure that it's brought further to the panelists. This talk, this discussion we split it into 2 parts. Now, to begin with, the first part, we will be more at the micro level. We will look into what the experience and learnings from 2020 has been, the impacts of COVID-19. We will listen to our speakers. They will have about 5 minutes each, and then we open the floor to the audience. And then after that session, we will kind of going a little bit more on a regional macro level, where we are looking into the human rights situation in 2021. What are your expectations? What kind of trends do you see, both for short and longer term? And we would also be listening to recommendations to states and donors. It will also be open for the audience to comment and raise questions to the panelists. So this is the setup for the coming big hour. And again, warm welcome to everyone. And now we just follow the order as I made in the introduction. So Shala, we go to you in Azerbaijan. How would you describe the key findings or lessons learned for you, for the community in Azerbaijan last year?
Thank you, Maria. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a big pleasure and honor to share this panel with all of you, my dear colleagues from Human Rights House Azerbaijan and beyond. So I'm very happy to be here. Well, to start with, I would like actually to give a little bit background information, because the title of our webinar is about the unprecedented times. And all those who know about the story in Azerbaijan, I think that they should be again reminded and briefed that in Azerbaijan, the unprecedented times started far earlier than 2020. So the unprecedented times for civil society, for human rights defenders, for women human rights defenders, for brave advocates and journalists and lawyers, all those who want to, who are respecting the fundamental rights and freedoms, for them, the unprecedented times started far earlier. For the civil society, for example, it all started from the crackdown from early 2014, when the legislation was completely changed, and there was practically ever since there is no favorable environment for registration, operation, and funding of local NGOs and donors. And as a consequence, of course, we have less than 1/5 of the NGO sector survived, and survival in this regard does not mean operational. Yet another peculiarity of our unprecedented times is the fact that we had the escalated conflict in the middle of last year, which grew, unfortunately, into the new stage of the war. The consequences of the war are beyond, of course, the explanation. We had a human losses, we had the damaged infrastructure on both sides, and definitely a lot of emotional and humanitarian, I would say, crisis in both countries. But it also gave us, it deteriorated and made our context even more difficult. And of course, COVID-19. This is something which was absolutely new. It was new and for the entire planet. And there is a rare country which was completely ready for this sort of crisis. In the countries like Azerbaijan, the good governance of which has been the system itself was damaged for years, and for more than 3 decades, we have the ruined infrastructure of healthcare, for example, ruined by the corruption and malpractice and negligence, and the same with the education. Of course, we are seeing the very grave facts of human rights violations in all these sectors. So if in normal times, the countries which were having the proper system and could be managing the normal, systems, be that healthcare, be that transportation, information, whatsoever, in normal times, if they were doing good, and then in crisis, they had a deterioration. In Azerbaijan, which had the crisis in all the times, then the situation, of course, became graver. And the worst in this situation was that the civil society, which could play a very great role in the entire story, be that at the level of war and its response, be that on the level of prevention and response to COVID-related crisis, meaning the spread of information, advocacy, like recommendations for better strategies, including the unwinding strategy. Nothing of the kind occurred in Azerbaijan, just because of the damaged civil society per se. And of course, those organizations and people who were outspoken during the time, they were spotted very easily, because there is really a handful of people left in the country who dare to voice out these issues. So coming from this context, of course, I can give a very long list of all the damages and negative consequences of this story, which again is interrelated. It didn't happen just for COVID-19, it happened for a complex of issues and the lack of good governance in the country. And we have seen it we are still seeing a lot of consequences of that, meaning, for example, we have interrupted education, a very poor level of online and digital preparedness of education system to the online classes. So basically, it can hardly be called as a good education year for the students, be that adults or the children. It is very huge number of underserved people in the healthcare facilities, because before COVID-19 restrictions, when the travel was there, it's official statistics, it's about 250,000 of Azerbaijanis every year were traveling to neighboring countries for medical services, medical interventions, checkups, etc. So all these people were practically locked inside the country, and the capacity of the healthcare system was not sufficient. So a lot of people died not of COVID or damaged or lost their health, not because of the COVID per se, but generally because of the unpreparedness of the healthcare infrastructure to embrace, to accept, to make the service for their own people. We have the raised escalation of GBV cases around across the country, and this is also quite a common phenomenon in the entire world. I know that, but in Azerbaijan, we have again a special situation because we didn't have data in the normal times. There is no system which is registering the cases of GBV. We have quite a big number of femicides, which can hardly be presented as femicides by the law enforcement. So they are trying to put the different naming on it. But in the crisis time, we have even worse situation because the capacity of the governmental structures was not sufficient to address these cases, was not sufficient to collect even the cases and to be able to assess how grave the situation is. And of course, I can make a lot more details, but the main thing is that there was practically no resistance from within because the total unpreparedness in combination with the lack of environment, in combination with physical restrictions. Like, for example, I'm a women human rights defender working for more than 20 years for human rights and women's rights and gender equality. But the lockdown rules, for example, did not allow me as a women human rights defender to be flexible and available enough to provide this service, to outreach to my constituencies. So we had the times out of 12 months in Azerbaijan, more than 6 months were the strict lockdown. And in Azerbaijan, they was applied the methodology of SMS system, meaning that you have formal only 2 or 3 hours in different times. It was either 2 or 3 hours to go outside. And of course, we all are human beings. We have our basic needs. So we were trying to serve ourselves, our basic needs, buy the food, buy the pharmacies, etc., visit the clinic. And then only after that, if the time is sufficient, then we would be able to provide the service to our constituencies, which means that in this particular time, these people could not outreach or receive the well quality service from us either. Just for the comparison with other sectors, the lockdown did not apply as strictly to all the professions. For example, journalists did have the permission from the government. They were in the list of the permitted professions to skip over this particular rule of 2 hours limitation. And lawyers, for example, the same. But for human rights defenders, they didn't apply anything of the kind that put our constituencies in a bigger risk. And I can definitely elaborate more on that, but I'll be ready to answer all your questions when the second round time comes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Shala. There is a lot of information, a lot to follow up. We will have more time for that. We will then go to Tatiana in Ukraine, and we are curious to learn of your experience from last year. What did the COVID-19 trigger on your side, and was there anything good coming out of the experience last year?
Good morning, dear colleagues from Kiev. I'm delighted to see all of you, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. Ukraine had a lot of crises during the last decades. We had 2 revolutions, Orange and Euromaidan. We have 7 years of military conflict with the Russian Federation, Russian military aggression, occupation of part of the Ukrainian territories in Crimea and Donbass. We've passed through several financial and economic crises. COVID for us became one more crisis that our country and our society are experiencing. And of course, for us, this one more crisis also is very, very painful. And as in many countries, and I also heard from Shala about Azerbaijan, our healthcare system was not ready for that. We just started the reform of healthcare sector, and all the COVID happened at the beginning of the reform, which was very, very painful and very big challenge for the country. And of course, during these COVID times, during the last year, as human rights defenders, we've also experienced a lot of threats. Our NGO monitors persecutions and attacks on human rights defenders, and despite the lockdown and quarantine introduced in Ukraine, the number of attacks that we fixed is the same as we fixed during the previous years. COVID-19 wasn't able to stop these attacks, including physical attacks, threats, intimidations, etc. And also last year we fixed 13 dangerous draft laws registered in our parliament, Verkhovna Rada, which are hostile for civil society, which also required from human rights organizations a lot of work and advocacy with members of parliament to stop voting for this legislation, including, for example, foreign agent legislation that was draft bill was sent to our parliament. And of course, human rights defenders were involved in the monitoring of the actions of the state officials, including law enforcement agents, about the proportionality of their actions and different types of limitations and restrictions imposed due to quarantine, but in some situations they stepped over human rights. We had a lot of, despite all quarantine and periodic lockdowns in Ukraine, we had a lot of peaceful demonstrations held in Kiev, also in other different cities of Ukraine, and police not in every case behaved accordingly to the standards and legislation in the situation. And also, of course, the whole situation with coronavirus was a big challenge to the groups that are vulnerable for discrimination, including women, including Roma, including homeless people, LGBTI community. And one specific challenge that we have here was the situation on the occupied territories. They were isolated, but after the start of quarantine, the people living in the territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and Donbass, they've gotten in the situation of the double isolation. And at the beginning of lockdown, the travel bans and restrictions were imposed from both sides of checkpoints. People were not able to travel at all, and as human rights defenders, we worked. We put a lot of efforts to convince government to open our check lines and to allow to cross the border for people living on the occupied territories to move for humanitarian reasons, for example, if they are ill or if they are persecuted for political reasons. And of course, as human rights defenders, and I'm leading the human rights NGO, we have some benefits from it, and I can just mention several. We have bigger audiences. After the beginning of quarantine, people started to search internet, to surf, so audiences of our websites and our social networks boosted, and we have easier, quicker access to stakeholders using online. We are able to save our time and budget, not to travel, and also we've switched to electronic documents, less paper, more eco-friendly in many situations, but from the other times, we lost this personal touch and involvement of stakeholders to the problems that we are addressing them. We have the, I think, fatigue from working online and a lot of events online. That is why I do hope that we will be able to come back to normal life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tiziana. We have Rosta in sitting in Prague to also share with us, leading a center on a regional level. You know, a center that provides grants. You are supporting or run capacity building and learning processes with quite a few partners out there. Now, how would you describe the main challenges, trends, also positive things, if you can find something that is actually a good lesson learned to bring further? How was it for you? What did you see, Rosna?
Sure. Thanks for having us part of this conversation. And I'm happy to share the perspective. And indeed, as Maria said, we very much look at the whole region of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I'd say that 2020 was really a tough and an incredibly eventful year. I think for many in the West, the whole year was a lot about the pandemic. But I'd say that this was just, for the region itself, this was just one and oftentimes by far not the most important of crises that were taking place almost simultaneously. So just to give you an overview, so we had war, a huge war with, actual casualties, lots of blood on both sides that has in the South Caucasus and Karabakh, that has actually redrawn in a way the map of it and changed the situation that was in place the past 30 years. We had one revolution in Kyrgyzstan that where kind of the actual grievances about elections were then seized by some, criminal groups and installed a new regime tilted to autocracy. We had one attempt at revolution in Belarus, a huge, unexpected outburst of energy, of civic discontent. We have constitutional crisis in Georgia. We had at the same time elections in Moldova where pro-democratic candidate won over the corrupt former regime. So really, kind of, we had a huge number of events and crises to deal with at the same time, and as I say, it was overwhelming for many of our partners, and it put strain on us as well. But I'd say what we saw was in many places really civil society standing up and really providing crucial assistance at a time of need for their societies. So in Belarus, for instance, we saw amazing humanitarian effort of volunteers who actually supplied hospitals with basic medical equipment when the state didn't really care. And in many ways, this has then fueled the public discontent with the regime as a whole. We saw human rights organizations in Armenia organizing humanitarian assistance again in the beginning of the pandemic, but then also as the war broke out. We saw human rights lawyers in many places actually advising businesses on how to deal with the new situation of the pandemic, of the taxes and the new regimes that were sprang up immediately. So I'd say that in many places we really saw civil society standing up and rising to the occasion and providing some crucial assistance to their societies. And overall, I think that simply the last year has shown or brought to the fore a larger trend that we see already for some time, and that is that the younger, more active part of society is increasingly impatient with this sclerotic, deeply corrupt post-Soviet type of regime that is there in many places still. In many societies have shed off this already, but many places in the region still have this kind of sort of government, and people are increasingly impatient. And sort of this COVID pandemic, but also of these other crises, they have shown the sort of ineptitude or inability of these elite to actually deal with the real governance issue. And I would like to just point out 3 trends that I see that I think are positive. I see many more civic activists actually now taking a more political path, trying to run for local councils, even in repressive environments, or trying to somehow join or influence political parties. I think that's great and actually healthy for societies. I see women leadership. I think that there is a growth. The most visible example is Belarus, where you saw how when wives of their husbands who had been jailed stood into their shoes and actually showed an enormous amount of leadership and excellent leadership, even if they didn't ask for it before. And I think there is a trend of this, and there is actually, I can speak later about why this makes sense. And then there's Navalny, I think, which is in a way something that is unprecedented. He's somebody who has kind of run anti-corruption work for years, has been poisoned with a nerve agent, facing this harrowing sort of prospect of gradual organ failure. I don't think we can all really imagine what sort of terrible experience that is. Now, then go through it and then go back to the country knowing what the regime will do to him. And in a way he says, I don't care, you are petty thieves, and I'm just gonna walk through that fear. I'm not afraid of you. And I think in that sense, he is really, in a historic way, helped break Russian society, one of the circles of fear, which of course the regime is trying to create all the time. So really, I think we have seen huge crises, but we have also seen incredible examples of courage, of kind of perseverance, of sort of hope that people expressed in the face of the crises. And I think this kind of much more tense conflict between these two we will continue to see into the future.
Thank you so much, Rostam. As you said, we will come back to issues that all of you raise in your first introduction. So I just continue now we go to Poland, and quite a few of us have been following the situation there, the developments, and we have Jacek leading a think tank, and we're thinking that's more, you do your research, the monitoring research analysis, but how could you continue doing that work? And your colleagues, how was the situation for you? And what are you coming in with here?
Well, first of all, thank you for making me part of this conversation and the opportunity to speak about our experiences and also about our research, because I wanted to mention some of the results of at least one research project on the impact of COVID on democracy in the EU that I was and my institute was participating in. And indeed, as far as the type of organization that I run is concerned, for us, COVID was not such a big challenge. I mean, we moved to working online, the research continued. We organized lots of online meetings. Of course, there is this Zoom fatigue factor, but it wasn't a bad year from that point of view, really. We produced a lot of papers. What was very difficult and also frustrating was that as part of our aim is actually to enhance democracy, we were witnessing that under the guise of COVID, the deterioration of democracy in Poland, as well as in some other countries in the EU, has speeded up. And that's one of the results of this research project that I mentioned. And our research, our advocacy has limited effectiveness in the situation of such overwhelming forces, societal and political forces that we observed during the COVID crisis. So if you allow me, I wanted to say 2 sentences about this big picture within the EU that we could reconstruct from our research, and then focus more about developments in Poland, which are very disturbing, because here the democratic backsliding, which was evident well before the pandemic, has actually speeded up. And as I called it in an essay that I wrote on this topic, the COVID served as a catalyst for authoritarianism in Poland. But EU is supposed to be a special area where democracy is the only game in town. It's part of EU values. But even here under COVID, the responses in different countries produced quite different results for democracy and also for human rights. So generally, in countries where democracy, but also social trust in public institutions was high, when democracy was robust and the social trust was high, did quite well in terms of observing democratic procedures and human rights. And here basically the Scandinavian or northern members of the EU come out particularly well in comparison. However, in other countries, and especially this is the case of Poland and Hungary, which were on the way to authoritarianism really before the pandemic, the situation became quickly deteriorated even further. But also across the EU, we could see one phenomenon that the executive branch of government has been strengthened. So even in the countries where you wouldn't worry too much about democracy, you could see stronger executive and problems with parliamentary oversight of the actions of the executive, which was justified by the need to move quickly, to make quick decisions. I mean, we've seen it across the EU, but only in some countries this was used as actually an excuse to trample down on some civic and human rights, as was the case in Poland. So that there were, I would say, there were several problems with the way COVID was used by Polish populist government, and I would just highlight 2 problems. One was the lack of constitutional foundations for all the restrictions that were introduced, lifted, and reintroduced during the course of pandemic. Polish government had a recourse to state of natural disaster, which is a constitutional condition for restricting basic human rights such as freedom of assembly. But the government didn't want to use this recourse because it would also mean that presidential elections, which were scheduled for the pandemic, would have to be postponed. So basically, according to most legal experts and authorities, all the restrictions that were being introduced were lacking constitutional, or in fact were in breach of the constitution. However, it was very difficult for citizens, for groups of citizens or civil society to actually do something about it because of the pressure put on courts, and especially the fact that the Constitutional Tribunal, which should intervene in this case and should review the laws, is basically now controlled by our government, so it has lost its autonomy. So this problem with rule of law destruction in Poland now was, on one hand, it was exacerbated by the COVID, but also it showed that when a government uses pandemic as an excuse for restrictions, we really need independent judiciary to limit the power of government, and we need a strong parliamentary oversight. And both were weakened by the conditions of COVID. And it had direct impact on civic liberties and human rights in Poland. What happened really was that when the second wave of pandemic hit the country, the government's incompetence and claims that the pandemic is over were exposed as just lies, and there was a big crisis of faith and support for the government. So what happened was that the government used its well-known tactics of polarizing society and basically ordered the Constitutional Court to further restrict the reproductive rights of women, and they introduced even more strict regulations on abortion, basically outlawing, banning abortion in almost all cases, which in turn led to huge protests, mainly of women, who took to the streets. And really the size of this protest, despite that it was in the middle of the worst wave of pandemic, surprised everybody, both on government and opposition. And I think the government did not expect this kind of situation. But what happened was a massive counter-strike and use of police force against the protesters. Again, under the excuse of the pandemic, the government used really very extreme police measures. And also, which is, I think, something that you wouldn't think occurring in a EU member state, one of the deputy prime minister responsible for public security actually called for right-wing militias to intervene and help to, so like Polish equivalent of Titushki, basically, tactics, to help bring down the protests. And this application of brutal police repressions and the COVID conditions actually managed to bring the protest down, but of course it didn't solve any of the problems. So this is a very negative experience, and the only positive conclusion out of it is that basically what Rosta already mentioned in the case of Belarus and some other countries here, even though the protests are now almost vanished, the women's movement is very strong, and I think that women will remain active in Poland. And I think one of the recommendations for donors is that these new initiatives, as well as some old women's initiative, women movements and civil rights movements, need to be supported by international donors, because Polish government is basically closing down most of the opportunities to get funding domestically for such organization, which they deem as dangerous for their continuation of continued stay in power. And my second conclusion is that the EU institution needs to get more serious about well, I would even use the word enforcing or making sure that democratic and human rights standards are observed across the EU, because the EU is sometimes very active in supporting, promoting democracy outside its borders, but it has cases like Poland and Hungary, which are within the EU and are very clear and, in my view, undisputable cases of democratic backsliding. And the EU is quite helpless in addressing this issue. Even this new mechanism that was introduced to the reconstruction fund, the EU money to help get the economy back on track after pandemics, there was a special rule of law mechanism attached after protests from Poland and Hungary. This mechanism was unfortunately watered down, and as members of civil society here in Poland are very doubtful whether it will have any real impact, so that in the end we may face the situation where the EU reconstruction fund has been already nicknamed as peace re-election fund, because it will help the government which botched really the response to pandemic now to regain regain social support using the EU funding, which is very ironic. And so my recommendation would be for the EU to really get serious about this rule of law mechanism and make sure that the funds are distributed really in a way to help Polish economy and the society recover, rather than to help the government to recover their support ratings. So that would be my two recommendations for donors and for EU. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jacek. We will have more time later today to dwell more on these issues, but thank you so much to feeding into that discussion as well. Katie, before we finalize this session and go into the next, we are keen to hear from you. Working for the Human Rights House Foundation, you're based in Georgia. You work closely with civil society in several countries, and again, you provide this protection of targeted human rights defenders in the region. What are your main reflections on 2020?
Thank you, Maria. This year, 30 years have passed since most countries in Eastern Europe, most post-totalitarian countries in Eastern Europe, have gained or regained their independence. And indeed, as my previous speakers and my colleagues have outlined, it seems that we have always been living in unprecedented times. Civil wars, international armed conflicts, internal disturbances, rally dispersals. It seems we've seen it all. And then the time came for the pandemic. So probably, we thought, okay, so now we have to live through the pandemic as well. And in this part of the world, one can say never a boring moment, always at the heart of historically significant events. But I think that also has its own charm and creates the opportunities for us to develop and grow faster. What we saw during this year, the year of the pandemic, was that the governments in the totalitarian countries that most of us are from here today as well, they really treated human rights as something that rests in their powerful hands, something that they can dispose of as they wish. They can sometimes limit for freedoms without the formal basis in the Constitution, as some of the previous speakers have outlined. They treat human rights as something that they can distribute beat by beat, portion by portion to the people they rule as they deem fit, abusing pandemic measures, misusing pandemic measures, and not always basing their arguments on the science. I think this trend, which was already characteristic to the countries that have experience with totalitarianism, the countries who were former members of the USSR, this is a very dangerous trend, which we should be very careful about if this becomes the habit of these governments. However, irrespective of these unprecedented challenges in yet another year of these countries' independence, I think we've seen some of the very positive developments as well. We saw that the one group who has really risen to the challenge, the one group who was really prepared, democratically mature, thinking on its feet, creative enough, was the civil society, and more so than the governments. They seemed to be more efficient in countering the measures, encountering the consequences of the pandemic, thinking on their feet, finding ways to support those most in need in the regions, most vulnerable groups, mostly also among the poor, within the LGBTQI community, women, children who have really suffered immensely as a result of the inequalities and social injustice that was laid bare following the pandemic. And the civil society really, we saw that they fought on all fronts. The pandemic and the measure that I've just listed, they've undertaken to support the most in need. They've also been countering in courts or in other policy ways the government who was willing to curtail freedoms further, and they were doing their watchdog, often election watchdog work in parallel. And lastly, and something that we should not ignore, they have also been countering the risks and the threats coming from the right-wing radical groups who are very strong nowadays. From the country that I work on, I would probably outline Georgia, Armenia, and Ukraine as the ones where they're particularly strong, sometimes with their affiliation to Russia. So they really fought on all these fronts. And it's a work in progress, but I think the observation is that the civil society is far more successful and far more mature and prepared and instrumental to counter the crisis like we've seen last year. The second interesting observation, and also a positive observation, seems to me that now that we're all glued to our computers and to, the rooms of our children with some pirate ships behind us, we really see that solidarity is very important. Solidarity was a big word last year to me, and I think to many of my colleagues and our friends gathered here today. Some have really complained about the lack of it, linked to some armed conflicts. Some have really seen more of it and are really happy with the results. But I think everyone agreed that the solidarity matters, particularly in the Eastern Partnership region, among the nations who share this common past and many common challenges. And I think it's very important that we continue paying attention to the importance and the content of the solidarity and how it empowers and strengthens us when the times are hard. And the last observation I'd like to make is that as the governments become stronger and more powerful in consolidating power and abusing some of the measures and misusing the laws and sometimes violating constitutions, people are pushing back. We saw across most of the countries, people on the street, new movements emerging, environmental movement in Georgia, in Armenia, animal rights protests we saw in Baku, though people knew it was dangerous even to protest on animal rights. We see people on the streets coming out also in Ukraine supporting human rights defenders who are targeted. So people are claiming back their rights and they're not willing to give them up. So I think that's also something that is very positive. And if people can do it during the pandemic when the lives and health are in danger, then of course the hope is that this movement hopefully will go stronger as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Katie. And thank you to all of you for these introductions. It's been quite serious issues that you are bringing forward, but there are also some more positive, good things coming out. I would like to give you time to have a little back and forth in the panel. I mean, listening to others, you have comments. If you would like to take the floor to comment on some of the things that you've heard, please do so. I would like to ask you again, before we go to more a macro level, we hear about how tough it is for civil society because there's so much of repression, and we hear about people really working day and night, doing their best, but there is this problem issue about the burnout. How do you see that in your community? Now we're talking about an individual level, you being a leader for an organization, for programs, and you're responsible for your staff and for your colleagues, in addition to yourself. How has that been? How is it for you when it comes to this being able to continue the work and to avoid the burnout? To avoid the stress influencing us too much. I wonder, looking at Tetiana, would you like to share with us how that is in Ukraine and for you?
Yes, I was just thinking about traveling by plane. And I think many of us almost forgot this feeling, how to get on board, etc. But we do remember the safety instructions. They are repeated every time when we travel, and every time we are told, in the case of cabin decompression, first put an oxygen mask on you and then on a child sitting behind you. And I think that the whole society and the human rights sector is now in the case of decompression, when we also have to think about our well-being, and when oxygen masks are literally needed by people in the hospitals, but figuratively they are also needed by our teams. And I think it's very important in this time to think about self-charge, about preventing burnout, about psychological support for the team, and these are a sort of programs that we are planning to introduce in our team. And I think it is also very important to have this flexibility, because for some people it is easier to work from home, for others it might be much more difficult because they have kids, because they need like the social ties and other people to work effectively. That is why it is very important also to have that individual approach, and for some people in our staff, they were continuing to come at least for 1 day a week to office, because for them it was easier to survive, while others just worked from home. And we will continue to plan this as the holistic security program and support for the staff.
Thank you, Tatiana. In addition, now we have questions coming in from the audience, and they do really wonder, been listening to you now, how one question is, how would you assess how civil society overall is doing in your country following a year of a pandemic and other challenges that you have described already? Shala, please.
Thank you very much, Maria. I think that's a very important question, actually giving me the opportunity also to make a few highlights on the positive trends, since I didn't mention that, but I'll start from the questions. Indeed, we do have the positive examples of donors' reaction, partners' reaction to the crisis. And in our case, it was the approach to us making the programming and activities more flexible, in the meaning that not just to provide a flexibility in terms of timing and, let's say, the form and formats of the activities, but also giving us the space to think of the capacities of the organization and address those needs and requirements based on the assessment of the NGO or the expert or whoever is working on the human rights on itself. So in contrast to what we have observed in the past, recent past and the distant past, it's very unfortunate that still the donors, unfortunately, are having more tendency for donors-driven initiative, like they are having their own mandates, and some are trying to adjust them to their requirements, to the needs, domestic needs of the country, but some are having their higher supreme programs and they want the organizations to fulfill whatever is in their priority. So what I observed during the last year is more understanding and flexibility of the donor, which was also mirroring their solidarity feeling that we have to join the efforts and try to go as smooth as possible through these easy times. And of course, the observation was those organizations and people who were well equipped also technically, because the burnout is happening when you are lacking not just the space for your activity, but also your capacities, when you are lacking your tools. And it's more likely to happen with people and organizations which are having these restrictions from all the sides. But those organizations and people who actually have the modern equipment, who are having the well updated gadgets, which can accommodate and are technically compatible with these modern communication platforms, they pass through this stage easier, much easier and smoother, and they still could outreach due to diverse digital methods, not just to their audiences, but also to their, let's say, to their colleagues and peers and audience at the regional and international level. So I definitely want to acknowledge those few donors and partners which show this unprecedented flexibility, I would say, and understanding, tailoring their priorities to the needs. I think that it should definitely be replicated in normal times as well. And I think that gives us, I think how efficiently it brings the results. I think that it should be also the case during the normal times after COVID as well. Yet another few positive trends was, and I fully echo some of my colleagues here who already mentioned some, but I will talk of the Azerbaijani case. You know, that the people of Azerbaijan are quite tolerant, and they have been tolerating all these injustices and human rights violations for 3 decades now, and seeing that there is no rule of law and no space for justice, people were more likely to go out of the country, to out-migrate. And what we have observed in the last few decades was the huge brain drain. People were mostly going out for education, for work, and they tried to settle down their lives outside of Azerbaijan for the lack of space for changes inside the country. But this lockdown and, all these travel restrictions related to COVID, it actually gave completely different picture of reality to the people. It was actually the time when people, even if they have sufficient financial resources and all the opportunities, even those who have been enrolled before to the educational facilities or they got their jobs, they actually could not physically be able to move out of the country, which made them stay inside the country and concentrate more on the issues which could actually be changed if there is more solidarity behind the actions. So instead of escaping, and as a human being, I fully understand those people who want a better life and who is not able to see to put the efforts, who is not capable and brave enough to fight for that. I understand as human being, but I don't, and I've never understood them as citizens, because all those countries which are appealing to us, they are good enough just because their citizens stayed where they are, and because they preferred changing it inside the country rather than escaping to the better setting. So these unprecedented times brought us to the situation when people, even with a follow-up vision to out-migrate later in the next year, still they were face-to-face with a system which, again, with some efforts, possible to change. And personally, to me, it gave a very good observation of people's escalated ownership, I would say. Maybe it's temporary, I don't know, but what I see, and it's also related to the part related to war, and I will elaborate more on that during my recommendations. But what I also observed, and I shared that feeling, that was the unprecedented feeling of solidarity from all the sectors and the war. And it was not just the war, but also the feeling of being in the same boat. That was a united point. So I stop here. Thank you for this opportunity.
Very good. Thank you so much, Shala. There are questions coming in now from the audience, and I think I'm looking at the time. We have 30 more minutes. So quite a few of the questions coming are concerning what now, which is the next session that we are entering. So I suggest that now, when you're coming in, you are looking into what are the main trends and challenges in 2021 going forward, and what are your needs, what are your recommendations to states, to donors. We have kind of both with the messages from Tatiana and Shala now entered into that, but I would like to invite the rest of you for the next 30 minutes that we will dwell on that. Jacek, you also introduced a few suggestions already, or recommendations already. So let's continue on that. So one question that is coming from a participant is that what's the path forward for civil society and governments who may have been at odds over COVID restrictions? That's one. And then another question that's kind of linked to this, or taking it further, and the question is, how are the so-called like-minded states supporting civil society in your country, in your region, either through the embassies, through their foreign ministries? And again, so what are your messages what kind of messages do you have for them? What kind of recommendations do you have for them? So they're kind of coming in, looking into kind of the same areas. So I would like to invite you, give you some minutes, 3-4 minutes each, and I go back to maybe Rosta and Jacek, if you would like to come in, and then Katie.
Okay, thank you. So I may actually start with I will try to zoom out and not say just one thing that I think is a bigger trend far beyond 2021. I think that's basically a trend for this decade. I think it will be increasingly difficult especially for the Eastern Partnership countries, to basically sustain themselves as independent and sovereign states, because Russia will make another serious advances to try to actually rebuild from Soviet Union, as much of the Soviet Union as they possibly can. And they have made serious advances in this regard. In the past decade, they haven't been as successful as they wanted, but they will continue, and they will be tougher now. So I think that's one serious challenge for the nations, actually, on the nations level. And here I think that's all we can say is in the best interest of the citizens of these countries and of Russians themselves, I believe, because this regime that tends to oppress them as well, but then also in the best interest of Europe, to actually keep Eastern Partnerships countries as independent and sovereign states. And everything we can do for that, I think, is welcome. Two, on the kind of lower level, I think there is really this, what I said, I think will play out on the level of, if you will, like type of governance or model of governance, or sort of civilizational clash, where on one hand you have this kleptocratic, deeply corrupt governance model that basically doesn't give a damn about people and is just trying to keep some legitimacy through this nationalist and increasingly more conservative agenda. And that's kind of exemplified by Russia, and Russia is the most active kind of proponent of this model. And then vaguely the European model, if you like, that's at least how people understand that. And that's kind of the idea of more accountable, more open model of governance, where people have chance to participate. There are some rules, there's rule of law, etc. And like between these two, I think we will see a lot of there and back. I think good example now is the elections in Armenia, where you can see lots of these sort of corrupt forces try to regain higher ground. What I think is optimistic in this regard is that, as a rule, societies are very much on board, or populations are very much on board for this accountable, fairer, more sort of open type of governance. This is what people want, and Europe still has sort of attraction, or this idea, this model still has the attraction. That said, I mean, these autocrats, they will always try to incite conflict or start wars to, in a way, distract people from this. What can be done, or what I think we should be doing, is we're talking here about civil society, and I think that's very important, and we should, keep supporting civil society as much as we can. But I think we should understand that civil society in itself is not enough. That there are at least two more sectors that need equal, or that need support as well, and that's independent media. Independent media really plays a key role. This is the first thing that autocrats go after. Without open media, civil society has actually very little chance to have real impact on broader population, because it's confined into this very narrow, very small kind of bubble. So we need independent media. Very often in many countries there is actually no real business model for independent media in the country, and I think therefore funding actually can really play a role, and should. And lastly, I mentioned this kind of increasing trend of young people. We see that kind of excellent environmental activists who are now actually taking a much more political path, who want to go in politics and local politics. And I see that as an incredibly positive trend for the region and for their countries, because they just want to affect change on a bigger level. And I think for that too, for these people too, we need to create some offer of trainings, of capacity buildings, etc. It used to be there some 20 years ago, but it wrapped up in the past few decades, and I think we need to rebuild some of this, because this is really an increasing trend. And as I said, the populations, by and large, with some caveats, are actually on the side of these. And lastly, I couldn't stress this enough, the backbone of authoritarianism in the region is corruption. It's really these massive amounts, dozens and billions of dollars every year stolen from the populations that they rightfully belong to by the elites and stashed in West. And we just need to be serious, and we need to stop this happening. This is really the single most important issue. And this is what, again, populations in all of the countries that we talk about will be totally understand and will support this and support these efforts to actually root out this crazy, oligarchs and autocrats who buy up French Riviera or this high street estates in London and all sorts of that thing. We need to really stop that crackdown on it. There are some international investigations on that already happening. There's a great amount of excellent work, but we need to twice, 3 times, 10 times more of that, because the problem is really so huge that we just need to rise up to that challenge.
Mm-hmm. If I can continue after Rosta, I think that some of the things he said were also something I wanted to say. To me, one of the conclusions from observing and participating often in some of the protests, events, movements, demonstrations, is that mobilization of civil society is not enough, and civil society should be prepared and equipped for what you might call a long game or long march to recover or improve the situation, or at least reverse the backsliding that COVID accelerated. And it means also that donors should not only be so preoccupied with supporting projects or initiatives or startups, because this is, I think, the what I see as the regular donor mindset is like, let's constantly looking for something new, but invest in institutional resilience of civil society organizations that authoritarian governments are trying to destroy. So this is for me a very important thing. I mean, when we talked about how people in the sector feel, my own experience is that my colleagues, people that I work with, actually appreciated the relative security that the organization was giving them during this difficult times, that they had basically certain stability, ability to work, to make something productive, where things seem to be falling apart all around them. And I think that having institutions, having strong civil society institution is important. But I also wanted to support very much what Rostia said about other actors being at least equally important, and the fact that civil society on its own will not replace these other components of robust democracy, like free media, but I would also mention local governments, academia, and last but not least, vibrant and truly independent political opposition, because really in countries, especially countries where certain democratic processes still exist, you can really only achieve change through the ballot box, and if you don't have viable opposition, then all the protests will only slow down, possibly at best scenario, slow down the deterioration of human rights standards. So this is my other conclusion, that we are all in the same boats, and donors who want to support democracy should also think about how to support, sometimes through supporting civil society, these other pillars of a free society. So this is the second point I wanted to make. The third one, in the post-COVID era, there will be a lot of requests for assistance, and I already mentioned the EU Reconstruction Fund, but there will also be probably increased assistance from the so-called rich world to other parts of the world. And I think that the conditionality of observing certain standards like anti-corruption, human rights standards should be strengthened in these assistance packages given to government or governmental institutions. I mean, it really, this precedent that was set with the EU rule of law mechanism is a very bad precedent. And I suppose it might be easier to use it outside of the EU, or in extreme cases such as Russia or Belarus. I would consider a stronger sanction regime. I mean, for Belarus, for example, I think that banning imports to the EU of the oil that is refined in Belarus would be a very powerful tool of making the regime think twice about where it's going with its politics. So I think that conditionality and sanctions. And then, speaking of Russia, I think that with the crackdown going on in Russia, there is a growing importance of democratic diaspora. And Russia is one case, but there are other cases of other countries where donors can achieve limited impact, working with civil society inside the country, and they should really build alliances with diaspora organizations. And my last point would be really about the sort of countering bad examples coming out from authoritarian states like Russia. There was a question here about the anti-NGO legislation in Russia. And Poland and Hungary basically are working, and in Hungary this was already partly introduced legislation limiting civil society, which is very much inspired or based on this Russian handbook. And again, we need to think about ways of countering this when the legislation is not applied yet, or how to fight it in other countries. So I think that the example from Russia, or influence of its legislation, is really something to be reckoned with across the region, and also within the EU. So maybe I will stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacek. I know that Katie is eager to take the floor, so now I give you a few minutes. Please, Katie.
Thank you very much, Maria. When it comes to the outlook toward the future, and also trying to answer some of the questions that the audience had, one thing that cannot be highlighted enough, I think, is the importance of flexibility of the donors and the focus on the institutional support of the civil society. As we all know through our work, and as we all see, change takes time. The countries that we work in, they still lack human rights culture. This requires decades to build. This requires a lot of effort. As someone in the network of human rights houses once said, in the classic liberal society of a developed country, Civil society is mostly sometimes there to support some of the minority groups, while in this post-totalitarian Eastern European space, very often everyone needs support. And it's very important that the civil society is able to respond to the needs as it deems fit, so that it is able to do whatever it seems appropriate to them in response to the changing circumstances, which sometimes really change very rapidly. And as we saw, the pandemic was no hindrance to that last year. So we can only expect for the processes to accelerate in the future. So this is one of the good examples beyond some of the cases when really some of the major donors, including the EU, have really stepped up their COVID response support towards civil society to target those who have been particularly hardly hit by the pandemic and the economic downfall and also restriction of rights. The other thing, which is partly linked to flexibility and institutional support maybe as well, is the importance to focus on the emerging groups, grassroots movements, the environmental activists who are coming in, the trade unions that are slowly coming back to this space where we operate, to the people who self-organize and fight in their small areas for the justice and equality. It's very important that they find good synergies with the civil society so that they can bring change together. So it's very important to reach out to them as well. Another issue is to continue supporting some of the most vulnerable groups and also some of the most vulnerable human rights defenders, because as Tatiana rightfully outlined earlier as well, the defenders are sometimes the first responders and the ones who really go and help the ones most in need. The support to them replicates further. It means support to the larger society. And also, as another study within Human Rights House Foundation showed us, women human rights defenders, LGBTQI rights defenders, environmental activists, ones working on corruption, against corruption, journalists, and really the defenders in the regions are the ones who suffer more. So it's very important that the donors and the states continue supporting them and funding their activities, and also taking into account their own risks, their own needs, and their own burnout challenges. And when it comes to the risks, I will make, I think, the last point here, is that we see the emergence of right-wing and radical groups. They are very frequently, not always, supported by Russia as well. This is also part of this whole Russian influence on the states. It's not only the influence on the nation state as such in terms of national security, but it also finds its way into the civil society. It also finds its way through some soft law mechanism and these right-wing radical groups. In Georgia, we saw, for example, that this right-wing group, one of them was given a license to broadcast. They have their own TV now. We see that this pro-Russian, homophobic, misogynistic group now is formally entering the politics, and they are targeting physically the human rights defenders. So it is very important to focus on this and make sure that these groups do not have their way, because otherwise the game will be lost for all of us, because these groups target the rights defenders as much as the governments do in some countries. But of course, the governments remain the sources of risks in many other. I think this is where I will stop. And if there are some more questions, then maybe I will try to have a word or two if there's still time.
Thank you so much, Katie. We are having 5 more minutes. I would like to give a few minutes to Shala and Tatiana in the very end before I come up with a little final remark. So, Shala, would you be ready? And
Yes.
I give you 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. I think that it's very important to keep the spirit of solidarity, not just within the country, but also across the world, because what we have seen is that in the time of crisis, it's possible to keep this solidarity. And I think that more rational approaches should be applied based on needs, based on local context, and based on the realities. I think that a number one issue for Azerbaijani context should be mobilization of all the efforts to extend the civil society space, because without this, and there is a momentum for that, because we have the change context, we have the context during the COVID times and after the war, and there's still no stability there. So it was actually very visible to what extent the civil society is missing, to what extent it's needed inside. That's why I think that this momentum should be used and the efforts should be intensified at all levels. Please try to help us to be doing our work openly and with dignity, as we all are doing throughout this time. But let us do it, again, not latently, but openly. And the final thing is that one step should not exclude another. So if there is support to the civil society in creating the operation space, and if there is still no results in that, I think they should be made parallel efforts to build the capacities, to provide some flexible opportunities for those who are inside the country to continue living and fighting inside the country, so that the change agents are not leaving the country. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I have a lot to say, but already this momentum was very important. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And Tatiana, are you
Yes,
ready
thank you.
to take it further?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Actually, several colleagues voiced this recommendation. I wanted to mention to donors in these uncertain times when it's difficult to predict some events and to plan. We as human rights defenders need more flexibility in our actions, in choosing the strategies, in amending our activities to reach the goals that we have, and more core institutional support. This was mentioned by several colleagues. And from the government, at least in Ukraine, we need to simplify legislation and to introduce more online services, online component in the activities of NGO from one side, and from the other side, we need we need government to allow us easier access to crowdfunding, to working with the citizens, to diversify our financial sources. This is, I think, important, especially in these COVID times. And dear colleagues, many thanks for this discussion. I see that there are a lot of common that we have and challenges, and I was really delighted to hear to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we came in here, as I said, the background for us to meet was we all have had our annual reports and reflections of 2020, and we have made ours, and we wanted you to come in and join in with your experience, with your reflections on what the situation has been like in 2020. What is it that we have learned? What is it that we want to take further? What is it that we missed that we really need to get back to continue our work and have impact? So what I also remind us and the participants is that this is a discussion that is live and it's recorded. So it will also be available on the different platforms, on Twitter, on Facebook, and on the YouTube. We will also provide a brief summary to states and to donors, trying to get most of the recommendations and food for thought coming from the participants. I am coming in here, and I'd say that, again, thank you so much for providing this food for thought. We know that the pandemic is ongoing. We are not done yet. No one, at least I did not, believe that we would be sitting here today when March last year came and everything closed down. But here we are, and we have been in a crisis, and we have done our best, and it has to continue, and we have to learn from it. So But it is, I can hear now that there is this resilience, this strength, and that is the beauty with civil society. The beauty of people being in civil society is just fantastic. The braveness, the strength, and the courage, and yeah, braveness that people are having. Very, very good. And this is what you reflect coming in here. So it's very inspiring. So 3 things coming out. To sum up, it is 1, tidy up in your own garden, whether it's EU or it is other countries. Walk the talk. You have to keep up the human rights standards. You have to respect the rule of law. And if you don't tidy up in your own garden, how can you expect that to happen in other gardens? Second is, please provide an oxygen masks to civil society, and think in the way you are supporting it. Think about the actors, think about the youth, the new generation, think about the women. Look at who has been taken to the streets under very difficult times. We have heard here reference to the youth, reference to women. It means please continue supporting them and think wide. Third, it is about define your own red line. Not, again, it's like walk the talk. Define your red lines. Put support, put conditions to your support. Define and speak up about the red line. And means also you have to have a toolbox ready when that red line is crossed. So, dear people, dear Shala, dear Tatiana, Rosta, Jacek, and Katie, thank you so much. I think that everyone now understands why the foundation is so proud and inspired by knowing you and working with you, and we will continue. Have a nice day, have a nice week, and see you again very soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. It was good to talk. Thanks.